Hi, everybody. Welcome to Literature Out Loud, sponsored by Pitkin County Library and brought to you through the generosity of Thunder River Theater. I'm really glad to see you. I'm Janice Estey, and I'm going to be doing the show tonight with Amelia Wagner. And we'll be doing, there she is now, it's Amelia Wagner. And we're going to be featuring the beautiful works of Edith Wharton, who was the first woman to ever win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. Amelia, believe it or not, has done an entire Chautauqua season or more than one season, Amelia?
Several. I did
several seasons. A Chautauqua presentation as Edith Wharton. So there's nobody more qualified than she is to bring Edith Wharton to you. Amelia, if I could get you just to briefly say what drew you to Edith and what did you like most about portraying her?
I first want to qualify about the no one more qualified to bring you Edith Wharton. I don't think that's true. But I really enjoyed Edith's writing. I don't think enjoyed is quite the right word because none of them are happy. Almost none of them are happy. 98% are tragic. But they're so beautifully written and so clever that I thought it was worth the pain that reading them brings to talk about them further. And then you juxtapose that with Edith, who herself is a fascinating woman with sort of indefatigable personality, who did so much humanitarian work during the First World War, and who obviously broke ground in terms of women in literature. And I just couldn't pass it up.
Well, I'm awfully glad you didn't, because it's all a better place because you did what she did. And we've got two great stories, which are a little less on the tragic side than what she usually does. I'll be reading Roman Fever, which was written towards the end of her life, and Amelia will be reading a piece called Expiation, which was written quite a lot earlier, but unlike most of Edith's works, has a lot of comedy to it. I thought during an epidemic, a lot of tragedy wasn't exactly what we needed. So there you have it. So relax for a while, Amelia, and I will proceed with Roman Fever, which in its heyday was the name known in Rome for malaria. But it's so much more after you hear this piece. Thanks. Roman Fever, Edith Wharton. From the table at which they had been lunching, two American ladies of ripe but well-cared-for middle age moved across the lofty terrace of the Roman restaurant and, leaning on its parapet, looked first at each other and then down on the outspread glories of the Palatine and the Forum, with the same expression of vague but benevolent approval. As they leaned there, a girlish voice echoed up gaily from the stairs leading to the court below. "Well, come along then," it cried, not to them, but to an invisible companion, "and let's leave the young things to their knitting." And a voice as fresh laughed back, "Oh, look here, Bab's not actually knitting." "Well, I mean figuratively," rejoined the first. "After all, we haven't left our poor parents much else to do." And at that point, the turn of the stairs engulfed the dialogue. The two ladies looked at each other again, this time with a tinge of smiling embarrassment, and the smaller and paler one shook her head and colored slightly. "Barbara," she murmured, sending an unheard rebuke after the mocking voice in the stairway. The other lady, who was fuller and higher in color, with a small, determined nose supported by vigorous black eyebrows, gave a good-humored laugh. "That's what our daughters think of us." Her companion replied by a deprecating gesture. "Not of us individually. We must remember that. It's just the collective modern idea of mothers. And you see," half guiltily she drew from her handsomely mounted black handbag a twist of crimson silk run through by two fine knitting needles. "One never knows," she murmured. The new system has certainly given us a good deal of time to kill, and sometimes I get tired just looking even at this." Her gesture was now addressed to the stupendous scene at their feet. The dark lady laughed again, and they both relapsed upon the view, contemplating it in silence with a sort of diffused serenity which might have been borrowed from the spring effulgence of the Roman skies. The luncheon hour was long past, and the two had their end of the vast terrace to themselves. At its opposite extremity, a few groups, detained by a lingering look at the outspread city, were gathering up guidebooks and fumbling for tips. The last of them scattered, and the two ladies were alone on the air-washed height. "Well, I don't see why we shouldn't just stay here," said Mrs. Slade, the lady of the high color and energetic brows. Two derelict basket chairs stood near, and she pushed them into the angle of the parapet and settled herself in one, her gaze upon the Palatine. "After all, it's still the most beautiful view in the world." "It always will be to me," assented her friend, Mrs. Annesley, with so slight a stress on the "me" that Mrs. Slade, though she noticed it, wondered if it were not merely accidental, like the random underlinings of old-fashioned letters. Grace Annesley was always old-fashioned, she thought, and added aloud with a retrospective smile, "It's a view we've both been familiar with for a good many years. When we first met here, we were younger than our girls are now. You remember?" "Oh, yes, I remember," murmured Mrs. Annesley with the same undefinable stress. "There's that head waiter wondering," she interpolated. She was evidently far less sure than her companion of herself and of her rights in the world. "I'll cure him of wondering," said Mrs. Slade, stretching her hand toward a bag as discreetly opulent-looking as Mrs. Annesley's. Signing to the head waiter, she explained that she and her friend were old lovers of Rome and would like to spend the end of the afternoon looking down on the view, that is, if it did not disturb the service. The head waiter, bowing over her gratuity, assured her that the ladies were most welcome and would be still more so if they would condescend to remain for dinner. A full moon night, they would remember. Mrs. Slade's black brows grew together, as though references to the moon were out of place and even unwelcome, but she smiled away her frown as the head waiter retreated. "Well, why not? We might do worse. There's no knowing, I suppose, when the girls will be back. Do you even know back from where?" "I don't." Mrs. Annesley again colored slightly. "I think those young Italian aviators we met at the embassy invited them to fly to Tarquinia for tea. I suppose they'll want to wait and fly back by moonlight." Moonlight. Moonlight. What a part it still plays. Do you suppose they're as sentimental as we were? "I've come to the conclusion that I don't know in the least what they are," said Mrs. Annesley, "and perhaps we didn't know much about each other." "No, perhaps we didn't." Her friend gave her a shy glance. "I never should have supposed you were sentimental, Elida." "Well, perhaps I wasn't." Mrs. Slade grew her lids together in retrospect, and for a few moments the two ladies, who had been intimate since childhood, reflected how little they knew each other. Each one, of course, had a label ready to attach to the other's name. Mrs. Delphin Slade, for instance, would have told herself, or anyone who asked her, that Mrs. Horace Annesley, 25 years ago, had been exquisitely lovely. No, you wouldn't believe it, would you? Though, of course, still charming, distinguished. Well, as a girl, she had been exquisite. Far more beautiful than her daughter Barbara, though certainly Babs, according to the new standards at any rate, was more effective, had more edge, as they say. Funny where she got it with those two nullities as parents. Yes, Horace Annesley was, well, just the duplicate of his wife. Museum specimens of old New York. Good-looking, irreproachable, exemplary. Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Annesley had lived opposite each other actually, as well as figuratively, for years. When the drawing room curtains in number 20 East 73rd Street were renewed, number 23 across the way was always aware of it. And of all the movings, buyings, travels, anniversaries, illnesses, the tame chronicle of an estimable pair. Little of it escaped Mrs. Slade, but she had grown bored with it by the time her husband made his big coup in Wall Street. And when they bought an Upper Park Avenue apartment, had already begun to think, I'd rather live opposite a speakeasy for a change. At least one might see it raided. The idea of seeing Grace raided was so amusing that before the move, she launched it at a woman's lunch. It made a hit and went the rounds. She sometimes wondered if it had crossed the street and reached Mrs. Ansley. She hoped not, but didn't much mind. Those were the days when respectability was at a discount, and it did the irreproachable no harm to laugh at them a little. A few years later, and not many months apart, both ladies lost their husbands. There was an appropriate exchange of wreaths and condolences and a brief renewal of intimacy in the half-shadow of their mourning. And now, after another interval, they had run across each other in Rome at the same hotel, each of them the modest appendage of a salient daughter. The similarity of their lot had again drawn them together, lending itself to mild jokes and the mutual confession that if in old days it must have been tiring to keep up with the daughters, it was now at times a little dull not to. No doubt, Mrs. Slade reflected, she felt her unemployment more than poor Grace ever would. It was a big drop from being the wife of Delphin Slade to being his widow. She had always regarded herself with a certain conjugal pride as his equal in social gifts, as contributing her full share to the making of the exceptional couple they were. But the difference after his death was irremediable. As the wife of the famous corporation lawyer, always with an international case or two on hand, every day brought its exciting and unexpected obligation. The impromptu entertaining of eminent colleagues from abroad, the hurried dashes on legal business to London, Paris, or Rome, where the entertaining was so handsomely reciprocated, the amusement of hearing in her wake, "What? That handsome woman with the good clothes and the eyes is Mrs. Slade, the Slade's wife? Really? Generally, the wives of celebrities are such frumps." Yes, being the Slade's widow was a dullish business after that. In living up to such a husband, all her faculties had been engaged. Now she had only her daughter to live up to, for the son who seemed to have inherited his father's gifts had died suddenly in boyhood. She had fought through that agony because her husband was there to be helped and to help. Now, after the father's death, the thought of the boy had become unbearable. There was nothing left but to mother her daughter. And dear Jenny was such a perfect daughter that she needed no excessive mothering. Now with Babs Ansley, I don't know that I should be so quiet, Mrs. Slade sometimes half enviously reflected. But Jenny, who was younger than her brilliant friend, was that rare accident, an extremely pretty girl who somehow made youth and prettiness seem as safe as their absence. It was all perplexing. And to Mrs. Slade, a little boring. She wished that Jenny would fall in love with the wrong man even, that she might have to be watched, outmaneuvered, rescued. And instead, it was Jenny who watched her mother, kept her out of drafts, made sure that she had taken her tonic. Mrs. Ansley was much less articulate than her friend, and her mental portrait of Mrs. Slade was slighter and drawn with fainter touches. Elida Slade's awfully brilliant, but not as brilliant as she thinks, would have summed it up, though she would have added, for the enlightenment of strangers, that Mrs. Slade had been an extremely dashing girl, much more so than her daughter, who was pretty, of course, and clever in a way, but had none of her mother's, well, vividness, someone had once called it. Mrs. Ansley would take up current words like this and cite them in quotation marks as unheard of audacities. No, Jenny was not like her mother. Sometimes Mrs. Ansley thought Elida Slade was disappointed on the whole. She had had a sad life, full of failures and mistakes. Mrs. Ansley had always been rather sorry for her. So, these two ladies visualized each other, each through the wrong end of her little telescope. For a long time, they continued to sit side by side without speaking. It seemed as though, to both, there was a relief in laying down their somewhat futile activities in the presence of the vast memento mori which faced them. Mrs. Slade sat quite still, her eyes fixed on the golden slope of the Palace of the Caesars, and after a while Mrs. Ansley ceased to fidget with her bag, and then she too sank into meditation. Like many intimate friends, the two ladies had never before had occasion to be silent together. And Mrs. Ansley was slightly embarrassed by what seemed after so many years a new stage in their intimacy, and one with which she did not yet know how to deal. Suddenly, the air was full of that deep clangor of bells which periodically covers Rome with a roof of silver. Mrs. Slade glanced at her wristwatch. 5 o'clock already, she said, as though surprised. Mrs. Ansley suggested interrogatively, "There's bridge at the embassy at 5. For a long time, Mrs. Slade did not answer. She appeared to be lost in contemplation, and Mrs. Ansley thought the remark had escaped her. But after a while, she said, as if speaking out of a dream, "Bridge, did you say? Not unless you want to, but I don't think I will, you know." "Oh, no," Mrs. Ansley hastened to assure her. "I don't care to at all. It's so lovely here and so full of old memories, as you say." She settled herself in her chair and almost furtively drew forth her knitting. Mrs. Slade took sideway note of this activity, but her own beautifully cared-for hands remained motionless on her knee. "I was just thinking," she said slowly, "what different things Rome stands for to each generation of travelers. To our grandmothers, Roman fever. To our mothers, sentimental dangers. How we used to be guarded. To our daughters, no more dangers than the middle of Main Street. They don't know it, but how much they're missing." The long golden light was beginning to pale, and Mrs. Ansley lifted her knitting a little closer to her eyes. "Yes, how we were guarded." "I always used to think," Mrs. Slade continues, "that our mothers had a much more difficult job than our grandmothers. When Roman fever stalked the streets, it must have been comparatively easy to gather in the girls at the danger hour. But when you and I were young, with such beauty calling us and the spice of disobedience thrown in, and no worse risk than catching cold during the cool hour after sunset, the mothers used to be put to it to keep us in, didn't they?" She turned again toward Mrs. Ansley, but the latter had reached a delicate point in her knitting. 1, 2, 3, slip 2. "Yes, they must have been," she assented without looking up. Mrs. Slade's eyes rested on her with a deepened attention. "She can knit in the face of this. How like her." Mrs. Slade leaned back, brooding, her eyes ranging from the ruins which faced her to the long green hollow of the Forum, the fading glow of the church fronts beyond it, and the outlying immensity of the Colosseum. Suddenly she thought, it's all very well to say that our girls have done away with sentiment and moonlight, but if Babs Ansley isn't out to catch that young aviator, the one who's a Marchese, then I don't know anything, and Jenny has no chance beside her. I know that too. I wonder if that's why Grace Ansley likes the two girls to go everywhere together. My poor Jenny is a foil." Mrs. Slade gave a hardly audible laugh, and at the sound Mrs. Ansley dropped her knitting. "Yes? Oh, nothing. I was only thinking how your Babs carries everything before her. That Campolieri boy is one of the best matches in Rome. Don't look so innocent, dear. You know he is, and I was wondering, ever so respectfully, you understand, wondering how two such exemplary characters as you and Horace had managed to produce anything quite so dynamic. Mrs. Slade laughed again with a touch of asperity. Mrs. Annesley's hands lay inert across her needles. She looked straight out at the great accumulated wreckage of passion and splendor at her feet, but her small profile was almost expressionless. At length she said, "I think you overrate Babs, my dear." Mrs. Slade's tone grew easier. "No, I don't. I appreciate her and perhaps envy you. Oh, my girl's perfect. If I were a chronic invalid, I think I'd rather be in Jenny's hands. There must be times, but there. I always wanted a brilliant daughter and never quite understood why I got an angel instead." Mrs. Annesley echoed her laugh in a faint murmur. "Babs is an angel too." Of course. But she's got rainbow wings. Well, they're wandering by the sea with their young men, and here we sit, and it all brings back the past a little too acutely. Mrs. Annesley had resumed her knitting. One might almost have imagined, if one had known her less well, Mrs. Slade reflected, that for her also too many memories rose from the lengthening shadows of those august ruins. But no, she was simply absorbed in her work. What was there for her to worry about? She knew that Babs would almost certainly come back engaged to the extremely eligible Campolieri, and she'll sell the New York house and settle down near them in Rome and never be in their way. She's much too tactful. But she'll have an excellent cook and just the right people in for bridge and cocktails and a perfectly peaceful old age among her grandchildren. Mrs. Slade broke off this prophetic flight with a recoil of self-disgust. There was no one of whom she had less right to think unkindly of than Grace Annesley. Would she never cure herself of envying her? Perhaps she had begun too long ago. She stood up and leaned against the parapet, filling her troubled eyes with the tranquilizing magic of the hour. But instead of tranquilizing her, the sight seemed to increase her exasperation. Her gaze turned toward the Colosseum. Already its golden flank was drowned in purple shadow, and above it the sky curved crystal clear without light or color. It was the moment when afternoon and evening hang balanced in mid-heaven. Mrs. Slade turned back and laid her hand upon her friend's arm. The gesture was so abrupt that Mrs. Annesley looked up, startled. "The sun's set. You're not afraid, my dear?" "Afraid? Of Roman fever or pneumonia? I remember how ill you were that winter. As a girl, you had a very delicate throat, didn't you?" "Oh, we were all right up here, down below in the Forum. It does get deathly cold all of a sudden, but not here." "Ah, of course, you know, because you had to be careful." Mrs. Slade turned back to the parapet. She thought, "I must make one more effort not to hate her." Aloud, she said, "Whenever I look at the Forum from up here, I remember that story about a great aunt of yours. Wasn't she a dreadfully wicked great aunt?" "Oh, yes, Great Aunt Harriet. The one who was supposed to have sent her young sister out to the Forum after sunset to gather a night-blooming flower for her album. All our great aunts and grandmothers used to have albums of dried flowers." Mrs. Slade nodded. "But she really sent her because they were in love with the same man." "Well, that was the family tradition. They said Aunt Harriet confessed it years afterward. At any rate, the poor little sister caught the fever and died. Mother used to frighten us with the story when we were children." "And you frightened me with it. That winter when you and I were here as girls, the winter I was engaged to Delphin." Mrs. Annesley gave a faint laugh. "Oh, did I? Really frightened you? I don't believe you're easily frightened." Not often. But I was then. I was easily frightened because I was too happy. I wonder if you know what that means. Yes, Mrs. Annesley faltered. Well, I suppose that was why the story of your wicked aunt made such an impression on me. And I thought, there's no more Roman fever, but the Forum is deathly cold after sunset, especially after a hot day, and the Colosseum's even colder and damper. The Colosseum? Yes. It wasn't easy to get in after the gates were locked for the night. Far from easy. Still, in those days, it could be managed. It was managed. Often, lovers met there who couldn't meet elsewhere. You knew that. I dare say I don't remember. You don't remember? You don't remember going out to visit some ruins or other one evening just after dark and catching a bad chill? You were supposed to have gone to see the moonrise. People always said that expedition was what caused your illness. There was a moment's silence. Then Mrs. Annesley rejoined, Did they? It was all so long ago. Yes, and you got well again, so it didn't matter. But I suppose it struck your friends, the reason given for your illness. I mean, because everybody knew you were so prudent on account of your throat and your mother took such care of you. You had been out sightseeing late, hadn't you, that night? Perhaps I had. The most prudent girls aren't always prudent. What made you think of it now? Mrs. Slade seemed to have no answer ready, but after a moment she broke out, Because I simply can't bear it any longer. Mrs. Annesley lifted her head quickly. Her eyes were wide and very pale. Can't bear what? Why, you're not knowing that I've always known why you went. Why I went? Yes, you think I'm bluffing, don't you? Well, you went to meet the man I was engaged to, and I can repeat every word of the letter that took you there. While Mrs. Slade spoke, Mrs. Annesley had risen unsteadily to her feet. Her bag, her knitting, and gloves slid in a panic-stricken heap to the ground. She looked at Mrs. Slade as though she were looking at a ghost. No, don't, she faltered out. Why not? Listen, if you don't believe me. My one darling, things can't go on like this. I must see you alone. Come to the Colosseum immediately after dark tomorrow. There will be somebody to let you in, no one whom you need fear will suspect. But perhaps you've forgotten what the letter said. Mrs. Annesley met the challenge with an unexpected composure. Steadying herself against the chair, she looked at her friend and replied, No, I know it by heart, too. And the signature? Only your D.S. Was that it? I'm right. Am I? That was the letter that took you out on that evening after dark? Mrs. Annesley was still looking at her. It seemed to Mrs. Slade that a slow struggle was going on behind the voluntarily controlled mask of her small, quiet face. I shouldn't have thought she had herself so well in hand, Mrs. Slade reflected, almost resentfully. But at this moment, Mrs. Annesley spoke. I don't know how you knew. I burned that letter at once. Yes, you would. Naturally, you're so prudent. The sneer was open now. And if you burnt the letter, you're wondering how on earth I know what was in it. That's it, isn't it? Mrs. Slade waited. But Mrs. Annesley did not speak. Well, my dear, I know what was in that letter because I wrote it. You wrote it? Yes. The two women stood for a minute staring at each other in the last golden light. Then Mrs. Annesley dropped back into her chair. Oh, she murmured, and covered her face with her hands. Mrs. Slade waited nervously for another word or movement. None came, and at length she broke out, I horrify you. Mrs. Annesley's hands dropped to her knee. The face they uncovered was streaked with tears. I wasn't thinking of you. I was thinking It was the only letter I ever had from him. And I wrote it. Yes, I wrote it. But I was the girl he was engaged to. Did you happen to remember that? Mrs. Ansley's head drooped again. I'm not trying to excuse myself. I remembered. And still you went. Still, I went. Mrs. Slade stood looking down on the small bowed figure at her side. The flame of her wrath had already sunk, and she wondered why she had ever thought there would be any satisfaction in inflicting so purposeless a wound on her friend. But she had to justify herself. You do understand. I'd found out, and I hated you. I knew you were in love with Delphin, and I was afraid of you, of your quiet ways, your sweetness, well, I wanted you out of the way, that's all. Just for a few weeks, just till I was sure of him. So in a blind fury, I wrote that letter. I don't know why I'm telling you now. I suppose, said Mrs. Ansley slowly, it's because you've always gone on hating me. Perhaps. Or because I wanted to get the whole thing off my mind. She paused. I'm glad you destroyed the letter. Of course, I never thought you'd die. Mrs. Ansley relapsed into silence, and Mrs. Slade, leaning above her, was conscious of a strange sense of isolation, of being cut off from the warm current of human communion. You think me a monster. I don't know. It was the only letter I had, and you say he didn't write it. Yeah, how you care for him still. I cared for that memory, said Mrs. Ansley. Mrs. Slade continued to look down on her. She seemed physically reduced by the blow, as if when she got up the wind might scatter her like a puff of dust. Mrs. Slade's jealousy suddenly leapt up again at the sight. All these years, the woman had been living on that letter. How she must have loved him to treasure the mere memory of its ashes. The letter of the man her friend was engaged to. Wasn't it she who was the monster? You tried your best to get him away from me, didn't you? But you failed, and I kept him. That's all. Yes, that's all. I wish now I hadn't told you. I'd no idea you'd feel about it as you do. I thought you'd be amused. It all happened so long ago, as you say, and you must do me the justice to remember that I had no reason to think you'd ever taken it seriously. How could I, when you were married to Horace Ansley 2 months afterward? As soon as you could get out of bed, your mother rushed you off to Florence and married you. People were rather surprised. They wondered at its being done so quickly, but I thought I knew. I had an idea you did it out of pique, to be able to say you'd got ahead of Delphin and me. Girls have such silly reasons for doing the most serious things, and your marrying so soon convinced me that you'd never really cared. Yes, I suppose it would, Mrs. Ansley assented. The clear heaven overhead was emptied of all its gold. Dusk spread over it, abruptly darkening the 7 hills. Here and there, lights began to twinkle through the foliage at their feet. Steps were coming and going on the deserted terrace. Waiters looking out of the doorway at the head of the stairs, then reappearing with trays and napkins and flasks of wine. Tables were moved, chairs straightened, a feeble string of electric lights flickered out. Some vases of faded flowers were carried away and brought back replenished. A stout lady in a dust coat suddenly appeared, asking in broken Italian if anyone had seen the elastic band which held together her tattered Baedeker. She poked with her stick under the table at which she had lunched, the waiters assisting. The corner where Mrs. Slade and Mrs. Ansley sat was still shadowy and deserted. For a long time, neither of them spoke. At length, Mrs. Slade began again. I suppose I did it as a sort of joke. A joke? Well, girls are ferocious sometimes, you know, girls in love especially. And I remember laughing to myself all that evening at the idea you were waiting around there in the dark, dodging out of sight, listening for every sound, trying to get in. Of course, I was upset when I heard you were so ill afterward. Mrs. Annesley had not moved for a long time, but now she turned slowly toward her companion. But I didn't wait. He'd arranged everything. He was there. We were let in at once, she said. Mrs. Slade sprang up from her leaning position. Delphin came? He was there? They let you in? Ah, now you're lying. She burst out with violence. Mrs. Annesley's voice grew clearer and full of surprise. But of course he was there. Naturally he came. Came? How did he know he'd find you there? You must be raving. Mrs. Annesley hesitated as though reflecting. But I answered the letter. I told him I'd be there, so he came. Mrs. Slade flung her hands up to her face. Oh, God, you answered. I never thought of you answering. It's odd. You never thought of it. If you wrote the letter. Yes, I was blind with rage. Mrs. Annesley rose and drew her fur scarf about her. It is cold here. We'd better go. I'm sorry for you, she said as she clasped the fur about her throat. The unexpected words sent a pang through Mrs. Slade. Yes, we'd better go. She gathered up her bag and cloak. I don't know why you should be sorry for me, she muttered. Mrs. Annesley stood looking away from her towards the dusky secret mask of the Colosseum. Well, because I didn't have to wait that night. Mrs. Slade gave an unquiet laugh. Yes, I was beaten there, but I oughtn't to begrudge it to you, I suppose, at the end of all these years. After all, I had everything. I had him for 25 years. And you had nothing but that one letter that he didn't write. Mrs. Annesley was again silent. At length, she turned toward the door of the terrace. She took a step and turned back, facing her companion. I had Barbara, she said, and began to move ahead of Mrs. Slade toward the stairway. Pretty good, huh?
Sorry.
That is important. You could write a story.
Oh, that last line.
That last line. And moving right along, I would like to share with you my good friend Amelia Wagner reading Expiation by Edith Wharton.
Expiation by Edith Wharton. I can never, said Mrs. Featherell, hear the bell ringing without a shudder. Her unruffled aspect, she was the kind of woman whose emotions never communicate themselves to her clothes, and the conventional background of the New York drawing room, with its pervading implication of an imminent tea tray and of an atmosphere in which the social functions had become purely reflex, lent to her declaration a relief not lost on her cousin, Mrs. Clinch, who, from the other side of the fireplace, agreed, with a glance at the clock, that it was the hour for bores. Bores, cried Mrs. Featherell impatiently. If I shuddered at them, I should have a chronic ague. She leaned forward and laid a sparkling finger on her cousin's shabby black knee. I mean the newspaper clippings, she whispered. Mrs. Clinch returned a glance of intelligence. They've begun already. Not yet, but they're sure to now, at any minute, my publisher tells me. Mrs. Featherell's look of apprehension sat oddly on her small features, which had an air of neat symmetry somehow suggestive of being set in order every morning by the housemaid. Someone, there was rumors that it was her cousin, had once said that Paula Featherell would have been very pretty if she hadn't looked so much like a moral axiom in a copybook hand. Mrs. Clinch received her confidence with a smile. Well, she said, I suppose you were prepared for the consequences of authorship. Mrs. Featherell blushed brightly. It is their coming, she owned. It's their coming now. Now? The bishop's in town. Mrs. Clench leaned back and shaped her lips to a whistle which deflected in a laugh. Well, she said. You see, Mrs. Fetherell triumphed. Well, weren't you prepared for the bishop? Not now. At least, I hadn't thought of his seeing the clippings. And why should he see them? Bella, won't you understand? It's John. John? Who has taken the most unexpected tone. One might almost say out of perversity. Oh, perversity, Mrs. Clench murmured, observing her cousin between lids wrinkled by amusement. What tone has John taken? Mrs. Fetherell threw out her answer with the desperate gesture of a woman who lays bare the traces of a marital fist. The tone of being proud of my book. The measure of Mrs. Clench's enjoyment overflowed in laughter. Oh, you may laugh, Mrs. Fetherell insisted, but it's no joke to me. In the first place, John liking the book is such a false note. It puts me in such a ridiculous position. And then it has set him watching for the reviews. Who would ever have suspected John of knowing that books were reviewed? Why, he's actually found out about the clipping bureau. And whenever the postman rings, I hear John rush out of the library to see if there are any yellow envelopes. Of course, when they do come, he'll bring them into the drawing room and read them aloud to everybody who happens to be here. And the bishop is sure to happen to be here. Mrs. Clench repressed her amusement. The picture you draw is a lurid one, she conceded, but your modesty strikes me as abnormal, especially in an author. The chances are that some of the clippings will be rather pleasant reading. The critics are not all union men. Mrs. Fetherell stared. Union men? Well, I mean they don't all belong to the well-known Society for the Persecution of Rising Authors. Some of them have even been known to defy its regulations and say a good word for a new writer. Oh, I dare say, said Mrs. Fetherell, with the laugh her cousin's epigram expected. But you don't quite see my point. I'm not at all nervous about the success of my book. My publisher tells me I have no need to be, but I am afraid of it being a success de scandale. Mercy, said Mrs. Clench, sitting up. The butler and footman at this moment appeared with the tea tray, and when they had withdrawn, Mrs. Fetherell, bending her brightly rippled head above the kettle, continued in a murmur of avowal. The title, even, is a kind of challenge. Fast and loose, Mrs. Clench mused. Yes, it ought to take. I didn't choose it for that reason, the author protested. I should have preferred something quieter, less pronounced, but I was determined not to shirk the responsibility of what I had written. I want people to know beforehand exactly what kind of book they are buying. Well, said Mrs. Clench, that's a degree of conscientiousness that I've never met with before. So few books fulfill the promise of their titles that experienced readers never expect the fare to come up to the menu. Fast and Loose will be no disappointment on that score, her cousin significantly returned. I've handled the subject without gloves. I've called a spade a spade. You simply make my mouth water. And to think I haven't been able to read it yet because every spare minute of my time has been given to correcting the proofs of how the birds keep Christmas. There's an instance of the hardships of an author's life. Mrs. Fetherell's eye clouded. Don't joke, Bella, please. I suppose to experienced authors there's always something absurd in the nervousness of a new writer. But in my case, so much is at stake. I've put so much of myself into this book, and I'm so afraid of being misunderstood, of being, as it were, in advance of my time, like poor Chaubert. I know you think me ridiculous, and if only my own reputation were at stake, I should never give it a thought. But the idea of dragging Jean's name through the mire. Mrs. Clench, who had risen and gathered her cloak about her, stood surveying from her genial height her cousin's agitated countenance. Why did you use John's name, then? There's another of my difficulties. I had to. There would have been no merit in publishing such a book under an assumed name. It would have been an act of moral cowardice. Fast and Loose is not an ordinary novel. A writer who dares to show up the hollowness of social conventions must have the courage of her convictions and be willing to accept the consequences of defying society. Can you imagine Ibsen or Tolstoy writing under a false name? Mrs. Featherell lifted a tragic eye to her cousin. You don't know, Bella, how often I've envied you since I began to write. I used to wonder sometimes, you won't mind my saying so, why, with all your cleverness, you hadn't taken up some more exciting subject than natural history. But I see now how wise you were. Whatever happens, you will never be denounced by the press. Is that what you're afraid of? Asked Mrs. Clinch, as she grasped the bulging umbrella which rested against her chair. My dear, if I had ever had the luck to be denounced by the press, my brougham would be waiting at the door for me at this very moment, and I shouldn't have had to ruin this umbrella by using it in the rain. Why, you innocent, if I'd ever felt the slightest aptitude for showing up social conventions, do you suppose I should waste my time writing nests jar and how to smell the flower? There's a fairly steady demand for pseudoscience and colloquial ornithology, but it's nothing, simply nothing, to the ravenous call for attacks on social institutions, especially by those inside the institution. There was often, to her cousin, a lack of taste in Mrs. Clinch's pleasantries, and on this occasion they seemed more than usually irreverent. Fast and Loose was not written with the idea of a large sale. Mrs. Clinch was unperturbed. Perhaps that's just as well, she returned, with a philosophic shrug. The surprise will be all the pleasanter, I mean, for of course it's going to sell tremendously, especially if you can get the press to denounce it. Well, how can you? I sometimes think you say such things expressly to tease me, and yet I should think you, of all women, would understand my purpose in writing such a book. It has always seemed to me that the message I had to deliver was not for myself alone, but for all the other women in the world who have felt the hollowness of our social shams. They ignore the idols of the market, but have lacked either the courage or the power to proclaim their independence. And I have fancied, Bella dear, that however severely society might punish me for revealing its weaknesses, I could count on the sympathy of those who, like you, Mrs. Featherell's voice sank, have passed through the deep waters. Mrs. Clinch gave herself a kind of canine shake, as though to free her ample shoulders from any drop of the element she was supposed to have traversed. Oh, call them muddy rather than deep, she returned. And you'll find, my dear, that women who've had any wading to do are rather shy of stirring up mud. It sticks, especially on white clothes. Mrs. Featherell lifted an undaunted brow. I'm not afraid, she proclaimed, and at the same instant she dropped her teaspoon with a clatter and shrank back into her seat. There's the bell, she exclaimed, and I know it's the bishop. It was, in fact, the Bishop of Oxenham, who, impressively announced by Mrs. Featherell's butler, now made an entry that may best be described as not inadequate to the expectations the announcement raised. The bishop always entered a room well, but when unannounced or preceded by a low church butler who gave him his surname, his appearance lacked the impressiveness conferred on it by the due specification of his diocesan dignity. The bishop was very fond of his niece, Mrs. Featherell, and one of the traits he most valued in her was the possession of a butler who knew how to announce a bishop. Miss Clinch was also his niece, but aside from the fact that she possessed no butler at all, she had laid herself open to her uncle's criticism by writing insignificant little books, which had a way of going into 5 or 10 editions, while the fruits of his own episcopal leisure, The Wail of Jonah, 20 cantos in blank verse, and Through a Glass Brightly, or How to Raise Funds for a Memorial Window, inexplicably languished on the back shelves of a publisher noted for her dexterity in pushing devotional goods. Even this discretion the bishop might, however, have condoned, had his niece thought fit to turn to him for support and advice at the painful juncture of her history when, in her own words, it became necessary for her to invite Mr. Clinch to look out for another situation. Mr. Clinch's misconduct was of the kind especially designed by Providence to test the fortitude of a Christian wife and mother, and the bishop was absolutely distended with seasonable advice and edification, so that when Bella met his tentative exhortations with a curt remark that she preferred to do her own house cleaning unassisted, her uncle's grief at her ingratitude was not untempered with sympathy for Mr. Clinch. It is not surprising, therefore, that the bishop's warmest greetings were always reserved for Mrs. Featherell, and on this occasion Mrs. Clinch thought she detected, in the salutation which fell to her share, a pronounced suggestion that her own presence was superfluous, a hint which she took with her usual imperturbable good humor. Left alone with the bishop, Mrs. Featherell sought the nearest refuge from conversation by offering him a cup of tea. The bishop accepted with the preoccupied air of a man to whom, for the moment, tea is but a subordinate incident. Mrs. Featherell's nervousness increased, and knowing that the surest way of distracting attention from one's own affairs is to affect an interest in those of one's companion, she hastily asked if her uncle had come to town on business. On business, yes, said the bishop in an impressive tone. I had to see my publisher, who has been behaving rather unsatisfactorily in regard to my last book. Ah, your last book, faltered Mrs. Featherell, with a sickening sense of her inability to recall the name or nature of the work in question, and a mental vow never again to be caught in such ignorance of a colleague's production. Through a glass brightly, the bishop explained, with an emphasis which revealed his detection of a predicament. You may remember that I sent you a copy last Christmas? Of course I do, Mrs. Featherell brightened. It was that delightful story of the poor consumptive girl who had no money and two little brothers to support. Sisters, idiot sisters, the bishop gloomily corrected. I mean sisters, and who managed to collect money enough to put up a beautiful memorial window to her grandfather, whom she had never seen, but whose sermons had been her chief consolation and support during her long struggle with poverty and disease. The bishop gave a satisfied sigh as the workman reviews his completed task. A touching subject, surely, and I believe I did it justice. At least so my friends assured me. Why, yes, I remember there was a splendid review of it in the Reredo, cried Mrs. Featherell, moved by the incipient instinct of reciprocity. Yes, by my dear friend Mrs. Gollinger, whose husband, the late Dean Gollinger, was under very particular obligations to me. Mrs. Gollinger is a woman of rare literary acumen, and her praise of my book was unqualified. But the public wants more highly seasoned fare, and the approval of a thoughtful churchwoman carries less weight than the sensational comments of an illiterate journalist. The bishop bent a meditative eye on his spotless gaiters. At the risk of horrifying you, my dear, he added with a slight laugh, I will confide to you that my best chance of a popular success would be to have my book denounced by the press. Denounced? Gasped Mrs. Featherell. On what ground? On the ground of immorality. The bishop evaded her startled gaze. Such a thing is inconceivable to you, of course, but I am only repeating what my publisher tells me. If, for instance, a critic could be induced, if a critic were to be found, who called in question of the morality of my heroine in sacrificing her own health and that of her idiot sisters in order to put up a memorial window to her grandfather, it would probably raise a general controversy in the newspapers, and I might count on a sale of 10 or 15,000 within the next year. If he described her as morbid or decadent, it might even run to 20,000, but that is more than I permit myself to hope. In fact, I should be satisfied with any general charge of immorality. The bishop sighed again. I need hardly tell you that I'm actuated by no mere literary ambition. Those whose opinion I most value has assured me that the book is not without merit. But though it does not become me to dispute their verdict, I can truly say that my vanity as an author is not at stake. I have, however, a special reason for wishing to increase the circulation of Through a Glass Brightly. It was written for a purpose I have greatly at heart. I know, cried his niece sympathetically, the chantry window is still empty at last, and I had great hopes that under Providence my little book might be the means of filling it. All our wealthy parishioners have given lavishly to the cathedral, and it was for this reason that, in writing Through a Glass, I addressed my appeal more especially to the less well endowed, hoping by the example of my heroine to stimulate the collection of small sums throughout the entire diocese, and perhaps beyond it. I am sure, the bishop feelingly concluded, the book would have been a widespread influence if people could only be induced to read it. His conclusion touched a fresh thread of association in Mrs. Featherell's vibrating nerve centers. I never thought of that, she cried. The bishop looked at her inquiringly. That one's book may not be read at all. How dreadful, she exclaimed. He smiled faintly. I had not forgotten that I was addressing an authoress, he said. Indeed, I should not have dared to inflict my troubles on anyone not of the craft. Mrs. Featherell was quivering with the consciousness of her involuntary self-betrayal. Oh, uncle, she murmured. In fact, the bishop continued, with a gesture which seemed to brush away her scruples, I came here partly to speak to you about your novel. Fast and Loose, I think you call it. Mrs. Featherell blushed assentingly. Is it out yet? The bishop continued. It came out about a week ago, but you haven't touched your tea, and it must be cold. Let me give you another cup. My reason for asking, the bishop went on, with the bland inexorableness which, in his younger days, he had been known to continue a sermon after the senior warden had looked 4 times at his watch. My reason for asking is that I hope I might not be too late to induce you to change the title. Mrs. Featherell set down the cup she had filled. The title, she faltered. The bishop raised a reassuring hand. Don't misunderstand me, dear child. Don't for a moment imagine that I take it to be in any way indicative of the contents of the book. I know you too well for that. My first idea was that it had probably been forced on you by an unscrupulous publisher. I know too well what ignoble compromises one may be driven in such cases. He paused, as though to give her the opportunity of confirming this conjecture. But she persevered in an apprehensive silence, and he went on, as though taking up a second point in his sermon. Or again, the name may have taken your fancy without you realizing all that it implies to minds more alive than yours to offensive innuendos. It is excessively suggestive, and I hope I am not too late to warn you of the false impression it is likely to produce on the very readers whose approbation you would most value. My friend Mrs. Bollinger, for instance. Mrs. Featherell, as the publisher of her novel testified, was in theory a woman of independent views, and if in practice she sometimes failed to live up to her standard, it was rather from an irresistible tendency to adapt herself to her environment than from any conscious lack of moral courage. The bishop's exordium had excited in her that sense of opposition which such admonitions are apt to provoke. But as he went on, she felt herself gradually enclosed in an atmosphere in which her theories vainly cast for breath. The bishop had the immense dialectical advantage of invalidating any conclusions at variance with his own, by always assuming that his premises were among the necessary laws of thought. This method, combined with the habit of ignoring any classifications but his own, created an element in which the first condition of existence was the immediate adoption of his standpoint, so that his niece, as she listened, seemed to feel Mrs. Gollander's Mechlin cap spreading its conventional shadow over her rebellious brow, and the Revue de Paris at her elbow, turning into a copy of the Reredos. She had meant to assure her uncle that she was quite aware of the significance of the title she had chosen, that it had been deliberately selected as indicating the subject of her novel, and that the book itself had been written in direct defiance of the class of readers for whose susceptibilities he was alarmed. The words were almost on her lips when the irresistible suggestion conveyed by the bishop's tone and language deflected them into the apologetic murmur, "Oh, uncle, you mustn't think. I never meant." How much farther this current of reaction might have carried her, the historian is unable to compute, for at this point the door opened and her husband entered the room. "The first review of your book," he cried, flourishing a yellow envelope. "My dear bishop, how lucky you're here." The trials of married life have been classified and catalogued with exhaustive accuracy. There is one form of conjugal misery which has perhaps received inadequate attention, and the suffering of the versatile woman whose husband is not equally adapted to all her moods. Every woman feels for the sister who is compelled to wear a bonnet which does not go with her gown. But how much sympathy is given to her whose husband refuses to harmonize with the pose of the moment? Scant justice has, for instance, been done to the misunderstood wife whose husband persists in understanding her, to the submissive helpmate whose taskmaster shuns every opportunity of browbeating her, and to the generous and impulsive being whose bills are paid with philosophic calm. Mrs. Fetherel, as wives go, had been fairly exempt from trials of this nature, for her husband, if undistinguished by pronounced brutality or indifference, had at least the negative merit of being her intellectual inferior. Landscape gardeners, who are aware of the usefulness of a valley and emphasizing the height of a hill, can form an idea of the account to which an accomplished woman may turn such deficiencies, and it need scarcely be said that Mrs. Fetherel had made the most of her opportunities. It was agreeably obvious to everyone, Fetherel included, that he was not the man to appreciate such a woman. But there are no limits to man's perversity, and he did his best to invalidate this advantage by admiring her without pretending to understand her. What she most suffered from was this fatuous approval, the maddening sense that, however she conducted herself, he would always admire her. Had he belonged to the class whose conversational supplies are drawn from the domestic circle, his wife's name would never have been off his lips. And to Mrs. Fetherel's sensitive perceptions, his frequent silences were indicative of the fact that she was his one topic. It was, in part, the attempt to escape this persistent approbation that had driven Mrs. Fetherel to authorship. She had fancied that even the most infatuated husband might be counted on to resent, at least negatively, an attack on the sanctity of the heart, and her anticipations were heightened by a sense of the unpardonableness of her act. Mrs. Fetherel's relations with her husband were in fact complicated by an irrepressible tendency to be fond of him, and there was a certain pleasure in the prospect of a situation that justified the most explicit expiation. These hopes Fetherel's attitude had already defeated. He read the book with enthusiasm. He pressed it on his friends. He sent a copy to his mother, and his very soul now hung on the verdict of the reviewers. It was perhaps this proof of his general ineptitude that made his wife doubly alive to his special defects, so that his inopportune entrance was aggravated by the very sound of his voice and the hopeless adoration of his smile. Nothing, to the observant, is more indicative of a man's character and circumstances than his way of entering a room. The Bishop of Othman, for instance, brought with him not only an atmosphere of episcopal authority, but an implied opinion on the verbal inspiration of the scriptures and on the attitude of the church toward divorce. while the appearance of Mrs. Featherell's husband produced an immediate impression of domestic felicity. His mere aspect implied that there was a well-filled nursery upstairs, that his wife, if she did not sew on his buttons, at least superintended the performance of the task, that they both went to church regularly, and that they dined with his mother every Sunday evening punctually at 7 o'clock. All this and more was expressed in the affectionate gesture with which he now raised the yellow envelope above Mrs. Featherell's clutch, and knowing the uselessness of begging him not to be silly, she said with a dry despair, "You're boring the bishop horribly." Featherell turned a radiant eye on that dignitary. "She bores us all horribly, doesn't she, sir?" he exulted. "Have you read it?" said his wife, uncontrollably. "Read? Of course not. It's just this minute come. I say, Bishop, you're not going." "Not till I've heard this," said the bishop, settling himself in his chair with an indulgent smile. His niece glanced at him despairingly. "Don't let John's nonsense detain you," she entreated. "Detain him? That's good," guffawed Featherell. "That isn't as long as one of his sermons. Won't take me more than 5 minutes to read. Here, listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. In this age of festering pessimism and decadent depravity, it is no surprise to the nauseated reviewer to open one more volume, saturated with the fetid emanations of the sewer." Featherell, who was not in the habit of reading aloud, paused with a gasp, and the bishop glanced sharply at his niece, who kept her gaze fixed on the teacup she had not yet succeeded in transferring to his hand. "Of the sewer," her husband resumed, "but his wonder is proportionately great when he lights as sweetly inoffensive as Paula Featherell's fast and loose. Mrs. Featherell is, we believe, a new hand at fiction, and her work reveals frequent traces of inexperience, but these are more than atoned for by her pure, fresh view of life and her altogether unfashionable regard for the reader's moral susceptibilities. Let no one be induced by its distinctly misleading title to forego the enjoyment of this pleasant picture of domestic life, which, in spite of a total lack of force in character drawing and of consecutiveness in incident, may be described as a distinctly pretty story." It was several weeks later that Mrs. Clinch once more brought the plebeian aroma of heated tramcars and muddy street crossings into the violet-scented atmosphere of her cousin's drawing-room. "Well," she said, tossing a damp bundle of proofs into the corner of a silk-cushioned bergère, "I've read it at last, and I'm not so awfully shocked." Mrs. Featherell, who sat near the fire with her head propped on a languid hand, looked up without speaking. "Mercy, Paula," said her visitor, "you're ill." Mrs. Featherell shook her head. "I was never better," she said, mournfully. "Then may I help myself to tea?" "Thanks." Mrs. Clinch carefully removed her mended glove before taking a buttered tea cake. Then she glanced again at her cousin. "It's not what I said just now," she ventured. "Just now? About fast and loose. I came to talk it over." Mrs. Featherell sprang to her feet. "I never," she cried dramatically, "want to hear it mentioned again." "Paula!" exclaimed Mrs. Clinch, setting down her cup. Mrs. Featherell slowly turned on her an eye brimming with the incommunicable. Then dropping into her seat again, she added, with a tragic laugh, "I have nothing left to say." "Nothing?" faltered Mrs. Clinch, longing for another tea cake, but feeling the inappropriateness of the impulse in an atmosphere so charged with the portentous. "Do you mean that everything has been said?" She looked tentatively at her cousin. "Haven't they been nice?" "They've been odious, odious," Mrs. Featherell burst out, with an ineffectual clutch at her handkerchief. "It's been perfectly intolerable." Mrs. Clinch, philosophically resigning herself to the propriety of taking no more tea, crossed over to her cousin and laid a sympathizing hand on the lady's agitated shoulder. "It is a bore at first," she conceded, "but you have to be surprised surprised to see how soon one gets used to it. I shall never get used to it, Mrs. Fetherell brokenly declared. Have they been so very nasty? All of them? Every one of them, the novelist sobbed. I'm so sorry, dear. It does hurt, I know, but hadn't you rather expected it? Expected it? Cried Mrs. Fetherell, sitting up. Mrs. Clinch felt her way warily. I only mean, dear, that I fancied from what you said before the book came out, that you rather expected, that you'd rather discounted. They're recommending it to everybody as a perfectly harmless story. Good gracious, is that what they've done? Mrs. Fetherell speechlessly nodded. Every one of them? Every one. Said Mrs. Clinch with an incipient whistle. Why, you just said it yourself, her cousin suddenly reproached her. Said what? That you weren't so awfully shocked. Well, you see, you teed me up so much of it that it wasn't quite as bad as I expected. Mrs. Fetherell lifted a smile, steeled for the worst. Why not say it at once, she suggested, that it was a distinctly pretty story. They haven't said that. They've all said it. My poor Paula, even the bishop. The bishop called it a pretty story. He wrote me, I've his letter somewhere. The title rather scared him. He wanted me to change it, but when he'd read the book, he wrote that it was all right and that he'd sent several copies to his friends. The old hypocrite, cried Mrs. Clinch. That was nothing but professional jealousy. Do you think so? Cried her cousin, brightening. Sure of it, my dear. His own books don't sell, and he knew the quickest way to kill yours was to distribute it through the diocese with his blessing. Then you don't really think it's a pretty story? Dear me, no, not nearly as bad as that. You're so good, Bella. The reviewers. Oh, the reviewers, Mrs. Clinch jeered. She gazed miserably at the cold remains of her tea cake. She said suddenly, do you happen to remember if the first review came out in an important paper? Yes, the Radiator. That's it, I thought so. Then the others simply followed suit. They often do if a big paper sets the pace. Saves a lot of trouble. Now, if you could only have got the Radiator to denounce you. That's what the bishop said, cried Mrs. Fetherell. He did? He said his only chance of selling Through a Glass Brightly was to have it denounced on the ground of immorality. Said Mrs. Clinch. I thought he knew a trick or two. She turned an illuminated eye on her cousin. You ought to get him to denounce fast and loose, she cried. Mrs. Fetherell looked at her suspiciously. I suppose every book must stand or fall on its own merits, she said in an unconvinced tone. Bosh! That review is as astute as the post-chaise and the packet ship. He belongs to the time when people read books. Nobody does that now. The reviewer was the first to set the example, and the public were only too thankful to follow it. As first they read the reviews, now they read only the publisher's extracts from them. Even those are rapidly being replaced by paragraphs borrowed from the vocabulary of commerce. I often have to look twice before I'm sure if I am reading a department store advertisement or the announcement of a new batch of literature. The publishers will soon be having their fall and spring openings and their special importations for Horse Show Week. But the bishop is right, of course. Nothing helps a book like a rousing attack on its morals. And as the publishers can't exactly proclaim the impropriety of their own wares, the task has to be left to the press or the pulpit. The pulpit, Mrs. Fetherell mused. Why, yes. Look at those two novels in England last year. Mrs. Fetherell shook her head hopelessly. There is so much more interest in literature in England than here. Well, we've got to make the supply create the demand. The bishop could run your novel up into the 100,000s in no time. But if he can't make his own sell, my dear, a man can't very well preach against his own writings. Mrs. Clinch rose and picked up her proof. I'm awfully sorry for you, Paul dear, she concluded, but I can't help being thankful that there's no demand for pessimism in the field of natural history. Fancy having to write The Fall of a Sparrow or How the Plants Misbehave. Mrs. Fetherel, driving up to the Grand Central Station one morning about 5 months later, caught sight of distinguished novelist Archer Hines hurrying into the waiting room ahead of her. Hines, on his side, recognizing her brougham, turned back to greet her as the footman opened the carriage door. My dear colleague, is it possible that we are traveling together? Mrs. Fetherel blushed with pleasure. Hines had given her 2 columns of praise in the Sunday Meteor, and she had not yet learned to disguise her gratitude. I am going to Ossining, she said, smiling. So am I. Why, this is almost as good as an elopement. And it will end where elopements ought to, in church. In church? You're not going to Ossining to go to church. Why not? There's a special ceremony in the cathedral. The chantry window is to be unveiled. The chantry window? How picturesque. What is a chantry? And why do you want to see it unveiled? Are you after coffee? Doing something in the Heisman's manner? La Cathédrale, eh? Oh, no. Mrs. Fetherel hesitated. I am simply going simply to please my uncle, she said at last. Your uncle? The bishop, you know. She smiled. The bishop? The bishop of Ossining? Why, wasn't he the chap who made that ridiculous attack on your book? Isn't that a prehistoric ass, your uncle? Upon my soul, I think you're mighty forgiving to travel all the way to Ossining for one of his stained glass sociables. Mrs. Fetherel's smile flowed into a gentle laugh. Oh, I've never allowed that to interfere with our friendship. My uncle felt dreadfully about having to speak publicly against my book. It was a great deal harder for him than for me, but he thought it his duty to do so. He has the very highest sense of duty. Oh, said he with a shrug. I don't know that he didn't do you a good turn. Look at that. They were standing near the bookstall, and he pointed to a placard surmounting the counter and emblazoned with a conspicuous announcement, Fast and Luke, new edition with author's portrait, 150,000. Mrs. Fetherel frowned impatiently. How absurd. They've no right to use my picture as a poster. There's our train, said Hines, and they began to push their way through the crowd, surging toward one of the inner doors. As they stood wedged between circumferent shoulders, Mrs. Fetherel became conscious of the fixed stare of a pretty girl who was eager to a companion. Myrtle, there's Paula Fetherel right behind us. I knew her in a minute. Gracious, where? Cried the other girl, giving her head a twist which swept her Gainsborough plumes across Mrs. Fetherel's face. The first speaker's words had carried beyond her companion's ear, and a lemon-colored woman in spectacles, who clutched a copy of the Journal of Psychology in her cotton-gloved hand, stretched her disengaged hand across the intervening barrier of humanity. Have I the pleasure of addressing the distinguished author of Fast and Loose? If so, let me thank you in the name of the Woman's Psychological League of Peoria for your magnificent courage in raising the standard of revolt against— You wouldn't tell us the rest in the car, said a fat man, pressing his good-humored bulk against the speaker's arm. Mrs. Fetherel, blushing, embarrassed and happy, slipped into the space produced by this displacement, and a few moments later had taken her seat in the train. She was a little late, and the other chairs were already filled by a company of elderly ladies and clergymen who seemed to belong to the same party, and were still busy exchanging greetings and settling themselves in their places. What ladies! And Mrs. Fetherel's approach uttered an exclamation of pleasure and advanced with outstretched hand. My dear Mrs. Fetherel, I am so delighted to see you here. May I hope you are going to the unveiling of the chantry window? The dear bishop so hoped that you would do so. But perhaps I ought to introduce myself. I am Mrs. Gollinger. She lowered her voice expressively. Her uncle's oldest friend, and one who was so close to him through all this sad business, and who knows what he suffered when he felt obliged to sacrifice family affection to the call of duty. Mrs. Fetherel, who had smiled and colored slightly at the beginning of the speech, received its close with a deprecating gesture. "Oh, pray don't mention it," she murmured. "I quite understand how my uncle was placed. I bore him no ill will for feeling obliged to preach against my book. He understood that and was so touched by it. He has often told me that it was the hardest task he was ever called upon to perform. And do you know, he quite feels that this unexpected gift of the chantry window is in some way a return for his courage in preaching that sermon." Mrs. Fetherel smiled faintly. "Does he feel that?" "Yes, he really does. When the funds of the window were so mysteriously placed at his disposal, just as he had begun to despair of raising them, he assured me that he could not help connecting that with his denunciation of your book." "Dear uncle," sighed Mrs. Fetherel. "Did he say that?" "And now," continued Mrs. Gollinger, with cumulative rapture, "now that you are about to show, by appearing at the ceremony today, that there has been no break in your friendly relations, the dear bishop's happiness will be complete. He was so longing to have you come to the unveiling." "He might have counted on me," said Mrs. Fetherel, still smiling. "Oh, that is so beautifully forgiving of you," cried Mrs. Gollinger enthusiastically. "But then the bishop has always assured me that your real nature was so very different from that which, if you will pardon my saying so, seems to be revealed by your brilliant but rather subversive book. He'll, if you only know my niece, dear Mrs. Gollinger," he always said, "you would see that her novel was written in all innocence of heart. And to tell you the truth, when I first read the book, I didn't think it so very, very shocking. It wasn't till the bishop explained to me. But my dear, I mustn't take up your time in this way when so many others are anxious to have a word with you." Mrs. Fetherel glanced at her in surprise, and Mrs. Gollinger continued with a playful smile. "You forget that your face is familiar to thousands whom you have never seen. We all recognized you the moment you entered the train, and my friends here are so eager to make your acquaintance. Even those," her smile deepened, "who thought the dear bishop not quite unjustified in his attack on your remarkable novel." A religious light filled the chantry of Ossining Cathedral, filtering through the linen curtain which veiled the central window and mingling with the blaze of tapers on the richly adorned altar. In this devout atmosphere, agreeably laden with the incense-like aroma of Easter lilies and forest lilacs, Mrs. Fetherel knelt with a sense of luxurious satisfaction. Beside her sat Archer Hines, who had remembered that there was to be a church scene in his next novel, and that his impressions of the devotional environment needed refreshing. Mrs. Fetherel was very happy. She was conscious that her entrance had sent a thrill through the female devotees who packed the chantry, and she had humor enough to enjoy the thought that, but for the good bishop's denunciation of her book, the heads of his flock would not have been turned so eagerly in her direction. Moreover, as she entered, she had caught sight of a society reporter, and she knew that her presence, and the fact that she was accompanied by Hines, would be conspicuously proclaimed in the morning papers. All these evidences of the success of her handiwork might have turned a calmer head than Mrs. Fetherel's, and though she had now learned to dissemble her gratification, it still filled her inwardly with a delightful glow. The bishop was somewhat late in appearing, and she employed the interval in meditating on the plot of her next novel, which was already partly sketched out, but for which she hadn't been able to find a satisfactory denouement. By a not uncommon process of ratiocination, Mrs. Featherell's success had convinced her of her vocation. She was sure now that it was her duty to lay bare the secret plated spots of society, and she was resolved that there should be no doubt as to the purpose of her new book. Experience had shown her that where she had fancied she was calling a spade, she had, in fact, been alluding in guarded terms to the drive themselves. She was determined not to repeat the same mistake, and she flattered herself with that her coming novel would not need an episcopal denunciation to ensure its sale, however likely it was to receive this crowning evidence of success. She had reached this point in her meditation when the choir burst into song, and the ceremony of the unveiling began. The bishop, almost always felicitous in his address to the fair sex, was never more so than when he was celebrating the triumph of one of his cherished purposes. There was a peculiar mixture of Christian humility and episcopal exaltation, and the manner with which he called attention to the Creator's promptness in responding to his demands for funds. He had never been more happily inspired than in eulogizing the mysterious gift of the chantry window. Though no hint of the donor's identity had been allowed to escape him, it was generally understood that the bishop knew who had given the window, and the congregation awaited in a flutter of suspense the possible announcement of a name. None came, however, though the bishop deliciously titillated the curiosity of his flock by circling ever closer about the interesting secret. He would not disguise it from them, he said. The heart which had divined his inmost wish had been a woman's. Is it not to woman's intuition that more than half the happiness of earth is owing? What man is obliged to learn by the laborious process of experience, woman's wondrous instinct tells her at a glance. And so it had been with this cherished scheme, this unhoped-for completion of their beautiful chantry. So much, at least, he was allowed to reveal. And indeed, had he not done so, the window itself would have spoken for him, since the first glance at its touching subject and exquisite design would show it to have originated in a woman's heart. This tribute to the sex was received with an audible sigh of contentment, and the bishop, always stimulated by such evidence of its sway over his hearers, took up his theme with gathering eloquence. Yes, a woman's heart had planned the gift, a woman's hand had executed, and, might he add, too far with drailing the veil in which Christian beneficence ever loved right attack. Might he add that, under Providence, a book, a simple book, a mere tale, in fact, which had had its share in the good work for which they were assembled to give thanks. At this unexpected announcement, a ripple of excitement ran through the assemblage, and more than one head was abruptly turned in the direction of Mrs. Featherell, who sat listening in an agony of wonder and confusion. It did not escape the observant novelist at her side that she drew down her veil to conceal an uncontrollable blush, and this evidence of dismay caused him to fix an attentive gaze on her, while from her seat across the aisle Mrs. Gollinger sent a smile of unctuous approval. A book, a simple book. The bishop's voice went on above this flutter of mingled emotions. What is a book? Only a few pages and a little ink, and yet one of the mightiest instruments which Providence has devised for shaping the destinies of man. One of the most powerful influences for good or evil which the Creator has placed in the hands of his creatures. The air seemed intolerably close to Mrs. Featherell, and she drew at her scent bottle and thrust it hurriedly away, conscious that she was still the center of an unenviable attention. And all the while, the bishop's voice droned on. And of all forms of literature, fiction is doubtless that which has exercised the greatest sway, for good or ill, over the passions and imaginations of the masses. Yes, my friends, I am the first to acknowledge it. No sermon, however eloquent, no theological treatise, however learned and convincing, has ever inflamed the heart and imagination like a novel, a simple novel, Incalculable is the power exercised over humanity by the great magicians of the pen, a power ever enlarging its boundaries and increasing its responsibilities as popular education multiplies the number of readers. Yes, it is the nautilus hands which can pour balm on countless human sufferings, or inoculate mankind with the festering poison of a corrupt imagination. Mrs. Fetherell had turned white, and her eyes were fixed with a blind stare of anger on the large-sleeved figure in the center of the chancel. And too often, alas, it is the poison and not the balm which the unscrupulous hand of genius proffers to its unsuspecting readers. But, my friends, why should I continue? None know better than the assemblage of Christian women, such as I am now addressing, the beneficent or baleful influences of modern fiction. And so, when I say that this beautiful chantry window of ours owes its existence in part to the romancer's pen, the bishop paused and, bending forward, seemed to seek a certain face among the countenances eagerly addressed to his. When I say that this pen, which for personal reasons it does not become me to celebrate unduly, Mrs. Fetherell at this point half rose, pushing back her chair, which scraped loudly over the marble floor. But Hines involuntarily laid a warning hand on her arm, and she sank down with a confused murmur about the heat. When I confess that this pen, which for once at least has proved itself so much mightier than the sword, is that which was inspired to trace the simple narrative of Through a Glass Brightly. Mrs. Fetherell looked up with a gasp of mingled relief and anger. When I tell you, my dear friends, that it was your bishop's own work which first roused the mind of one of his flock to the crying need of a chantry window, I think you will admit that I am justified in celebrating the triumph of the pen, even though it be the modest instrument which your own bishop wielded. The bishop paused impressively, and a faint gasp of surprise and disappointment was audible throughout the chantry. Something very different from this conclusion had been expected, and even Mrs. Gollinger's lips curled with a slightly ironic smile. But Archer Hines's attention was chiefly reserved for Mrs. Fetherell, whose face had changed with astonishing rapidity, from surprise to annoyance, from annoyance to relief, and then back again to something very like indignation. The address concluded, the actual ceremony of the unveiling was about to take place, and the attention of the congregation soon reverted to the chancel, where the choir had grouped themselves beneath the veiled window, prepared to burst into a chant of praise as the bishop drew back the hanging. The moment was an impressive one, and every eye was fixed on the curtain. Even Hines' gaze strayed to it for a moment, but soon returned to his neighbor's face. And then he perceived that Mrs. Fetherell, alone of all the persons present, was not looking at the window. Her eyes were fixed in an indignant stare on the bishop. A blush of anger burned becomingly under her veil. Her hands nervously crumpled the beautifully printed program of the ceremony. Hines broke into a smile of comprehension. He glanced at the bishop and back at the bishop's knees. Then, as the episcopal hand was solemnly raised to draw back the curtain, he bent and whispered in Mrs. Fetherell's ear. Why, you gave it yourself. You wonderful woman, of course you gave it yourself. Mrs. Fetherell raised her eyes to his with a start. Her blush deepened, and her lips shaped a hasty no. But the denial deflected into the indignant murmur. It wasn't his silly book that did it, anyhow. The end.
Amelia, that's a tour de force, I must say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Where else can you read Edith Wharton on a computer? I always say.
Probably nowhere.
Nowhere.
Nor can you listen to her. That's probably not true.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so glad that you would read with me. And I'm so glad that Thunder River lets us have Sean to make this work and make this happen. And I'd like to invite you, Amelia, and the rest of you out there to come next month on the 16th of September, when we'll be having the words of Anthony Doerr, who is also a Pulitzer Prize winner for literature, but in the year 2015, a different time for all the light we cannot see. And be safe, be happy, be good to each other, and read good books, huh?